a little bit later. Monetary policy, Fed's toolkit stuff. Again, make sure that you read the review notes just to make sure that some of this stuff sticks with you. Generally speaking, in this class, we'll talk in terms of expansionary policy versus contractionary policy, right? So expansionary monetary policy would be policy meant to grow aggregate demand. Contractionary policy would be, to reduce aggregate demand. This is also true as well for fiscal policy. So a big policy sort of conversation will be, should the government increase spending or cut taxes when there's a recession or some sort of economic dysfunction. And so, we'll again set up economic scenarios, have a policy response, and then ask ourselves, okay, depending upon the model in question, what does this policy response actually do for the things that we care about, right? So we have fiscal policy, we have monetary policy, but I like to just think in terms of simplicity, right? There is expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. Those are meant to boost aggregate demand. There are contractionary fiscal and monetary policies. Those are meant to constrain aggregate demand. Right. To some of this, there's a conversation about kind of how much should we bake in something like an automatic stabilizer. So should the government always respond to, for example, an increase in unemployment? Should the central bank always respond to, for example, an increase in inflation? Should policy be activist? Or should policy be strictly reactive? Or what's the balance between active and reactive policy? That ends up being a really important conversation that we have. One of the things that I really like to sort of engage in a conversation are lags, right? It takes a while for policies to sort of work their way through the economic system. And if we have a particular economic problem, we need to have a clear idea of how long we can expect a particular policy to sort of make its way through the economic system. And so understanding these policy lags becomes extremely important and ends up factoring into a lot of the conversations that we'll have a little bit later on. Phillips curve. This has become kind of one of the more important kind of contemporary ideas, the relationship between unemployment and inflation. So as you might know, the Federal Reserve has what we refer to as a dual mandate. And that dual mandate says that the Fed is supposed to have low, stable inflation and full employment. Right? These are the dual mandate. Now, the problem is that these things work in a sense against each other. So if you want to have really low unemployment, you're going to cause inflation. And if you want to reduce inflation, you're going to have to create higher unemployment. That's what the Phillips curve tells us. It is a negative relationship between the unemployment level and inflation. So when unemployment goes up, inflation goes down, and when unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. And so again, we go back and we ask ourselves during the COVID sort of scenario, did that play a role? Did our attempt to kind of keep unemployment from going up too much, did that then cause us to create some inflationary pressure? And of course it did. That's absolutely what happened. Now, a really interesting kind of set of questions in economics, and some that we'll get to in this class, is, what is the actual slope of this line? What is the slope of the Phillips curve? What is the actual quantitative relationship between unemployment and inflation? And so there's been some argument over time that the Phillips curve has flattened. And that the Phillips curve is less responsive than it was before, meaning that perhaps we might not be able to rely upon as we have in the past, this negative relationship, which is, a little bit frightening from an economic perspective because we've relied upon that relationship so much. So we'll talk more extensively about the Phillips curve a little bit later on. This kind of gives you a little bit of maybe just a slight, in the data downward relationship. If we just squint a little bit, we can see a Phillips curve there. It's probably more like this. It probably is pretty flat if you look at the data. But, again, we're going to take model predictions, we're going to take theory, and we're always going to look at the data. We're always going to ask ourselves, how does the model explain the data? And if it doesn't explain the data, then we say, what's wrong with the model? That's modern economics. It's an interplay between theory and empirical analysis. All right. So just, kind of a summary of the things that we've talked about. Again, things that, again, whether or not you completely remember these ideas, it's good to have them in your brain. There's a reason why we're doing this particular review session, right? Everything that you see in front of you on this slide, these will be things we will talk about very soon in class. And these will be things that we likely will bring back and talk about repeatedly. For price measurement, I just want to add here, again, we tend to focus more on CPI than we do GDP deflator. And you'll see that. That'll be the source of the conversation going on. All right. And then this is just some really interesting articles, kind of very recent articles that touch on the topics that I discussed in this particular lecture. So we have, again, the increase in U.S. Inflation rate in the month of April, up to 3.8%. That's significantly high. By the way, the Fed's inflation target is 2%. So at 3.8%, we're far above target. That's a big concern. We did have a nice positive labor report for the month of April, a positive uptick in the number of jobs created. That did follow a couple of months of negative job creation, which was very concerning. So the big hope is that this starts a trend and we see more job growth in the future, but we're waiting with bated breath a little bit there. We also recently got a big Federal Reserve policy decision where they decided to not do anything. But that's a big message being sent to markets that, listen, the Fed acknowledges there's these concerns in the U.S. economy, but they don't feel confident that raising or decreasing rates is a smart move right now. So they're going to hold rates steady. We'll talk a lot about central bank policy, monetary policy this session. And then lastly, the big word that I'm hearing these days that we're very concerned about is stagflation, right? Stagflation is the era of the late 1970s in the U.S. where we had simultaneous high unemployment and high inflation, right? We go back to the Phillips curve. The argument is that if you have high unemployment, you should have low inflation. But we had high unemployment and high inflation in the late 1970s. That's the so-called stagflation era. And with rising inflation and with what was previously a weakening labor market, there was really some concerns that we might be getting into some stagflation era economic scenario. But again, I think that we have to kind of make sure that we understand that stagflation means high unemployment. We have a 4.3% unemployment. That's not high unemployment at all. That's in fact historically low unemployment. So, I look at the word stagflation there. I am also concerned about it, but I think that's more of a clickbait word to be used there. Now, if unemployment ticks up and inflation continues to tick up, which is a very real possibility, then I'll start being worried about stagflation. But until then, we're going to let the data guide us. We're going to let the data kind of tell us where the U.S. economy is. And right now, the U.S. economy is a little bit sort of up in the air as to exactly what's going on. There's some good stuff. Recent job growth has been okay. A lot of investment in the economy. Consumer spending has been stable, not growing a lot, but also not declining very much. Inflation has been a nagging problem and will continue to be a problem sort of moving forward. There's also a big disconnect in the U.S. economy right now where all the money is being invested in technology, but the job growth is concentrated in sectors outside of technology. So healthcare is the big kind of unemployment thing. I'll just put healthcare here. Most of our job growth over the last couple of years has been, in fact, in healthcare, social services, and education, not labor pools tied to technological investment and things of that nature. So that's another kind of concern that we have, a bit of a disconnect there. What does that mean sort of moving forward? What does that mean, again, for kind of the economic system itself? That sort of remains to be seen in many respects. So anyway, well, this ended up being a lot longer than I intended it to be, but I do think this did a great job of kind of setting everything up. I think this makes for a very good kind of first day set of ideas just to get you sort of thinking about what you have previously probably learned. And again, I'll have nice set of lecture notes, review notes for you to check these things out. And as always, let me know if you have any questions. And otherwise, I look forward to seeing you in the next video.